Good to see everyone out on an absolutely beautiful morning this morning. Last few days have just been glorious, except for the smoke. Isn't that amazing? Burning California and Oregon, and we get to breathe it here. Just the scope of it is mind-boggling. We live economically in a really unique situation in this country, a situation the vast majority of the world doesn't understand, a situation that historically is almost unheard of. And what I'm making reference to here is that we have in our country a very large, what we call middle class. Historically, there's never been a middle class. You look at all of human history, and what you had was a dichotomy of a lot of very, very poor people and a few incredibly rich people. And that's been the way it's been almost since creation. The idea of a middle class such as we have is very unique. If you go around the world today, if you've had a chance to travel at all, particularly if you've gone into third world countries, but in the vast majority of this world, what you find is still exactly what I described. You go to Honduras, what you're going to find are a handful of very, very wealthy people. And you are going to find a bunch of incredibly poor people. Go to India, go to Mexico, I don't care where you go, that's what you're going to find. Now you have to understand that in order to appreciate what James is going to tell us here in James chapter 5, verses 1 through 6. Because what he's making reference to here has held true throughout most of history and unfortunately continues to hold true today. And that is this, that the wealthy have always had a tendency to take advantage of and abuse the poor. And God sees that. And they're going to answer for that. That's what this passage is about. And it's very sobering. You know, as you read through the Bible, there are times when prophets will blister people. Jesus, in Matthew chapter 23, boy, he lets the Pharisees and the scribes have it with both barrels. But in this section right here, you're going to find about as strong a language, warning-wise, as you're going to find in the Bible. As James talks really, really straight to these rich folks who are abusing the poor. By the way, if you'll notice in verse 4, we're going to read this passage in just a second. If you have your Bibles open, here's James 5. If you look at verse 4, it says, "The cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of Sabaoth." Literally is what that says. It's translated as host, and depending on your translation, it may say Sabaoth, but probably it will say Lord of Hosts. And what that's saying is very powerful. What that's saying is the God who is in control, the God who is more powerful than any rich person, period, the God who is the Lord of Sabaoth is going to hold you answerable for the way you use your money, for the way in which you get your money. Now, let's read it. "Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you, and will eat your flesh like fire. You've laid up treasure in the last days. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. You have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. You have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Now, why should the rich be weeping and howling? I want us to very soberly listen to what James says here. Because in a very real sense, and we've talked about this before, we're wealthy. Oh, we're middle class. Yeah, well, we're wealthy. You compare what you have to the rest of the world, and you are filthy rich. The vast majority of the world would love to trade places with you because you have so much more than so many of them can even think or imagine. We are wealthy. And I think it is very important that we take our wealth and we put it into the proper context. Now, he starts with that warning in verse 1 here. Come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Question, why do you weep and howl? You don't weep because you're having fun, do you? You weep because you're miserable. Why do you howl? You heard a dog howl? When's a dog howl? When they're hurting, right? When they're frightened, when they're miserable, when they're upset, that's when they howl. What he's saying here absolutely flies in the face of conventional wisdom, of earthly wisdom, doesn't it? Shouldn't he say, come now, you poor, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you? Because that's how most of the world understands it, right? It's the poor who need to be in mourning. It's the poor who need to be howling and moaning and weeping over what's going on. But God is real good about taking human wisdom and flipping it on its head. Happy are they that mourn. Really? Happy are the poor in spirit. Flies in the face of conventional wisdom, but it's absolutely true. And what is true here is that those who are rich need to be weeping and howling because the Lord of Sabaoth is observing. And he's not happy with what's happening. A couple of reasons he gives here why the rich should be weeping and howling. First of all, because they've obtained their wealth in unethical ways. Listen to him. They're cheating their workers, aren't they? James 5 verse 4. Behold, the wages of the laborers who mowed your fields, which you kept back by fraud, are crying out against you. And the cries of the harvesters have reached the ears of the Lord of hosts. Now you go back into the Old Testament, Leviticus chapter 19 verse 13. Here in the law of Moses, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. The wages of a hired worker shall not remain with you all night until the morning. Now once again, we're talking about a situation with which most of us are not very familiar. But throughout history, you've had day laborers. There have been billions of people through history who have fed their families by working every day for a wage for that day. They would gather at the gate of the city, they would gather in the marketplace, and they would wait for someone to come and hire them and pay them to work that day. And they would feed their family based on whether they got work or not. Down in Texas and New Mexico, where we're from, you still see this. Guys who will gather in areas and they wait for somebody to come and hire them so they have work that day. Well, this is something that's gone on for a long time. In the book of Matthew chapter 20, Jesus tells the parable there of the laborers in the vineyard. And that parable, if you read it, is rooted in this very thing. Guys who are waiting for somebody to come and hire them and pay them to work that day so they can feed their families that night. And what's happening? They work all day, and at the end of the day, the guy who hired them sneers at them and says, "Go home." "Well, wait a minute, you need to pay me." "No." And oh, by the way, guess what? If you don't work for free today, you don't work tomorrow. What are you going to do? Frustrated, angry, hurt, going home to babies who are hungry, a wife who's weeping because she can't feed her kids, and you worked all day long and he just ripped you off and there's nothing you can do about it. Now, there's nothing about that that's right. And it is something that had gone on. Leviticus 19:13, do you understand the gap between Leviticus 19:13 and James 5 verse 4 is roughly 1,500 years. 1,500 years. When Moses wrote this, people were ripping other people off, and Moses is telling the Jewish people, don't you do that. If a guy works for you all day, you pay him. Don't you hold his wages overnight because he's got to feed his family. You pay him what you owe him. 1,500 years later, what's going on? Same thing. Hasn't changed a lick. The rich still taking advantage of the poor. And James is saying it's not right. And God is paying attention. Don't you cheat other people in order to make your money. Don't you think that you can rip somebody off and God's not going to notice. Now he tells here of a second situation that also is very upsetting. And you have to go back to chapter 2 to find it. But, it jumps out at you in 2. Remember when he's talking about the poor guy and the rich guy who come to services? And everybody kowtows to the rich guy and kind of ignores the poor guy. In the midst of that, James 2 verse 6, are not the rich the ones who oppress you and the ones who drag you into court? And then in chapter 5 verse 6, you have condemned and murdered the righteous person. He does not resist you. Now listen to him. Think a second. Who's taking advantage of you? Who's taking advantage of the system? Who's constructed the system so that they win all the time, and if you're poor, you lose? Who's done that? The rich. Now, why would you be honoring a rich man in the worship service when there's a good chance that he's the one that's taking advantage of you? And unfortunately, that kind of thing continues to happen, doesn't it? It's not right. It breaks our hearts. It frustrates and angers us. But it happens. And again, listen, as God says, I'm paying attention. These folks who think that they can take advantage of the poor and rip off the poor and get away with it, God notices. The Lord of Sabaoth, the Lord of hosts, is paying attention. You are going to answer if you take advantage of poor people. Remember in Luke chapter 18, I think you find an excellent example of what he's talking about here. Jesus, that's the parable of the one who's called the importunate widow. That impatient widow, the one who comes to the judge and she keeps after him and she keeps after him and she keeps after him. Hear my case, hear my case, hear my case. And finally, she wears him out and he hears her case. What is Jesus talking about? The system. Where if you were rich, you got heard. Where if you were rich, you got quote unquote justice. If you were poor, judge wouldn't pay any attention to you. That's what they're dealing with. And he's saying it's not right. And again, please hear. Weep and howl, you who think you can take advantage of this situation, you who think you can take advantage of the poor, that you can take advantage of ripping people off. You will answer to the Lord of hosts. Now, having said that, why should the rich be weeping and howling? He gives 3 reasons why they've got the problems that they do, why they're going to answer for what they're doing. Number 1, listen to him. They've squandered their wealth on themselves. James 5 verse 3, you have laid up treasure in the last days. In other words, what? You've got more than what you need and you're just piling money up. Okay? James 5:5, you have lived on the earth in luxury and in self-indulgence. You have fattened your hearts in a day of slaughter. Now, let's jump back hundreds of years to the book of Amos, chapter 4, verse 1. Hear this word, you cows of Bashan, who are on the mountains of Samaria, who oppress the poor, who crush the needy, who say to your husbands, bring, that we may drink. Amos, speaking for God, is lighting into these people, saying, how dare you do what you're doing? Luke 12, 18 and 19. This is the parable of the rich fool. And he said, I will do this. I will tear down all my barns and build bigger ones, larger ones. And there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. What does the Lord of Sabaoth say? You fool, tonight your soul is going to be required of you. Again, see, keep in mind, God is paying attention. And next week, as we look at the message that he gives to people in the church who are having to deal with this situation, in essence, exactly what he's going to say to them is, you be patient. Understand that God is seeing what's going on. Why should the rich be weeping and howling? Because their wealth is only temporary. James 5 verse 2. Your riches have rotted, and your garments are moth-eaten. Verse 3, your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. How often do we forget that everything we've got is only temporary? We're not going to hold on to it forever. We're not. We'll use it for a while, but that's it. How many people have built their lives on their stuff, and then their stuff disappears? How many of you have had an opportunity to see the Marlin Mansion outside of Ponca City? Several. If you get a chance, you need to go visit that. Boy, there's a lesson there. Marlin made a ton of money in oil in the 20s. And he decided that he was going to build a palace on the plains. And so he brought over Italian workmen because he really liked Italian villas. And he literally imported these guys from Italy, built a house for them, and had them do the work on this castle that he built out on the plains. It is an amazing, amazing place. You walk into it, every bit of trim and everything hand carved. Ceilings painted like you would find in Italy in St. Mark's or one of the cathedrals. Incredible, incredible. Olympic-sized swimming pool outside of it. Lost all of his money in 29 in the crash. Never really got to live in and enjoy this place. I mean, you can't even put that irony into words. What happened with this old boy? All the money in the world and then nothing. You know what Michael Jackson and Johnny Depp and Nicolas Cage all have in common? These dudes have made hundreds of millions of dollars. Jackson died dead broke. These other two guys are in serious money trouble. They have run through hundreds of millions of dollars. We're not talking just millions of dollars. We're talking hundreds of millions of dollars. They got nothing to show for it. Why? Listen, don't lay up for yourselves treasures on earth where moth and rust corrupt and thieves break through and steal. Lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven where neither moth nor rust corrupt and where thieves do not break through and steal. Why? Because where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. There's part of me that really feels sorry for those guys because they built their life on nothing and they've got nothing and they're miserable. Well, Jackson's dead. The other two still alive, but you read about them and their lives are nothing but just an ongoing car wreck in every way. It's awful. Why should the rich be weeping and howling? Because they're building their life on something that won't last. What they're trusting to save them ultimately, James says, is going to destroy them. James 5 verse 3, your gold and silver have corroded, and their corrosion will be evidence against you and will eat your flesh like fire. Remember that verse out of Revelation 3 in that letter to the church at Laodicea? Whew. For you say, I'm rich, I've prospered, I need nothing, not realizing that you are wretched and pitiable and poor and blind, naked. Really? In my 6-bedroom home, with all my fancy cars sitting in the garage, and my fancy clothes, and my home on the beach, and my home in the mountains, and all the money I've got in the bank, I am wretched and pitiable and poor and blind and naked? Yeah. Because you see, you don't have what really matters. And you don't. They think that their wealth is going to protect them, don't they? And unfortunately, we have a tendency to think that way too. Boy, if I just got enough money, I'll be secure. Not a bigger lie around. Does money protect you from cancer? Does money protect you from a car wreck? Money protect you from a virus? Money protect you from a tornado? Money protect you from an earthquake? Money protect you from a fire? Ask those people out in California whose $3 and $4 and $6 million homes have burnt to the ground. Oh, I'm going to have enough money. I'll be okay. I'll be okay. Not necessarily. Not necessarily. You're depending on something that you really can't depend on. Weep and howl. Because there's an excellent possibility you're going to have your heart broken before it's all over. Let me close with this observation. Being wealthy is a mixed blessing. Let's be honest. If I took a poll right now and I said, okay, how many of you would rather be rich than poor? Well, you know, if I have the choice, who ain't going to choose rich? But you listen to God, and you may well come up with a different answer than that. When I first started to the school of preaching, one of the first classes that I took was one taught by a brother named Tex Williams. Tex was just back from South Africa, where he'd been doing mission work. And he taught us a class on the pastoral epistles, 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. One of the very first classes he taught, one of the very first classes I took. And I'll never forget something Tex said, and that was a long time ago. We're talking 50 years. Tex said, see my suit? He had a nice suit on. He said, I got a bunch of nice suits. I've bought every one of them at garage sales. He said, I used to think that it would be a great thing to have a lot of money. That I'd like to be rich. I could support myself. I could do this. I could do that. He said, it's begun to dawn on me as I've gotten older. God's doing me a favor keeping me poor. Because He knows Tex, and He knows that if I had a lot of money, I'd be in trouble. I'd make stupid decisions. I'd do stupid things. And I might lose my soul. I've come to see the fact that I'm going to go through this life without much as a blessing. A blessing. Because there's so many things, so many temptations, so many difficulties that I'm not going to have to endure. He's absolutely right. I've never forgotten that. Totally different perspective from the world's on stuff. Being wealthy presents wonderful opportunities to do good the poor will never enjoy. That's true. Man, I thank God. You know, we can sit down, write a check to help the needy in Honduras, those brethren down there. So that's wonderful. Great opportunity. In a little while, we'll take up our annual contribution for the orphans. Man, I am grateful that I can help those little kids that don't have a mom and a daddy. I really am. And we have multiple opportunities because we're blessed with resources to make a difference in the lives of other people. I've been with brethren that literally do not have 2 dimes to rub together. They've got no money. None. As good as their hearts are, as much as they might like to help somebody, they've got nothing to give. We're blessed because we can make a difference. We're blessed because we can give to those who are in need. And that is a wonderful blessing that's granted to us. At the same time, as I just mentioned in the remark that Tex made, that kind of where I drew this from, it also makes one vulnerable to multiple temptations that the poor will never face. If you're living on the backside of nowhere in Senegal, you don't have a drug problem. You got a survival problem. But you haven't got a drug problem. You don't have an alcohol problem. You don't have a gambling problem. Because you haven't got anything. The more we get, the more complex our lives get, right? The more we get, the more opportunities there are to mess up. The more ways that we can be pulled into stuff that we don't need to get into. That's a fact. Being wealthy carries with it all kinds of spiritual challenges and temptations that can eat us up. And just read the letters to the 7 churches in Revelation 2 and 3 and see if that's not true. The Scripture makes it clear that wealth is far more dangerous to the soul than poverty. In the book of Matthew chapter 19, verses 23 and 24, listen carefully to the words of Jesus. Truly I say to you, only with difficulty will a rich person enter the kingdom of heaven. Again, I tell you, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter the kingdom of God. We're blessed. We are. We've been blessed materially. We've been blessed spiritually. But we need to understand the responsibility that goes with that. We need to understand that the Lord of Sabaoth is watching how we use what we've been given. And the 2 lessons you can take from this are, number 1, what you've got, you better get clean. Don't you be taking advantage of other people. Don't you be cheating other people. Don't you be stepping on other people. If you're getting your money and there's any dirt on it, believe me, the Lord's paying attention. Now, He honors hard work. He honors honest living. But don't think He's going to ignore if you're ripping people off to get it, because He's not. He's paying attention. And number 2, don't make the mistake of thinking that because you've got it, you can spend it all on you. Oh, you can. You can, and people do. But God's going to pay attention to that too. How are you using what you have? Are you using it to bless the lives of others? Are you using it to bring Him glory? That's what He's looking at. Are you laying up treasure where it's going to be waiting for you? Laying up treasure in heaven. Harsh words, difficult subject, incredibly important one, and one I believe we need to hear. If we can help you this morning in your walk with the Lord, if you're ready to start that walk, as you confess Christ and you put Him on a baptism, if you're struggling with something, you need our prayers, need our help, we can help you in any way. Will you come while we stand and while we sing?